They stood on the road that wasn't theirs, their faces impassive beneath the rising sun. 1 minute, he was a man with a home, a history, a legacy. The next, a cold, steel cylinder blocked his path. A brand new padlock on the gate he'd welded himself. The camera cuts to his face, a mask of disbelief cracking into raw, primal fury. He shakes his head, a single, bitter laugh escaping his lips. Then, a quick-cut montage, a pristine private road, a glimmering construction sign, and a pair of bolt cutters being thrown into the back of a beat-up truck. The camera zooms in on his hands, calloused and shaking, as he reaches for something else in the truck. Bed, something sharp, something coiled, something that glints with a sinister promise. The voiceover is a low, guttural whisper. They thought they could erase me. They forgot what I build with, and they forgot how sharp my edges are. Part 1. The weight of steel. Elias Thorne's world began and ended with the rhythmic clang of hammer on steel. For 35 years, the workshop had been his sanctuary, a cavern of sparks, heat, and the acrid metallic temps of a life's work. The scent was a comfort, a signature of the Thorne legacy, passed down from his father. It was here, in the heart of the Willamette Valley, that he forged gates, repaired ancient farm machinery, and built the kind of beautiful, brutal ironwork that defined the character of a community. But that morning, the clang was missing. All that filled the silence was the buzzing hum of the Willamette Valley's cicadas and the sickening sense of wrongness. The gate to his property, a sprawling acre of land at the end of a private road, was shut tight. It wasn't just shut, it was sealed. A new heavy-duty padlock, industrial grade and glinting in the morning sun, had replaced the old, simple chain he'd always used. There was no key. There was no note. Only a small, officially stamped trespass notice pinned to the wooden post, fluttering in the gentle breeze. Elias stared at the lock, his mind refusing to accept the image. It was a violation, not of a gate, but of a trust, a history, a sacred space. He reached out a gnarled hand, his fingertips tracing the cold, unforgiving surface of the lock. He felt the weight of it, the quiet, deliberate aggression. This wasn't a mistake. This was a statement, the kind of statement that spoke of corporate lawyers and municipal bureaucrats. It spoke of the Sterling Valley development. For months, he had been the lone holdout. The developers, led by the impeccably tailored and utterly soulless Robert Sterling, wanted his land. It was the final stubborn puzzle piece they needed to connect their new luxury housing tract to the main county road. Sterling had offered a pittance, then a fair amount, then a ridiculous amount. Elias had refused them all. The land wasn't for sale. The workshop wasn't for sale. His grandfather had built the house. His father had built the workshop. Elias had spent a lifetime building his own legacy within its walls. Selling it would be selling his soul. Robert Sterling. "You son of a bitch," Elias muttered. The words a gravelly promise, in the still morning air. He drove his beaten-up Ford F-150 back down the gravel road, the tires crunching over the loose stones. The road itself was the source of the conflict. It was a private easement, owned jointly by himself and the 2 other properties that had already sold to Sterling's development. The road was his access, his right. They couldn't just block it, could they? The trespass notice said they could. It cited a new county ordinance, passed a week ago, that reclassified the road as an access point solely for the new development. With Elias's property no longer having deeded rights, the audacity of it made his blood boil. He knew they'd been working behind the scenes. He'd seen the lawyers, the town council members, the slick-haired men in suits coming and going. He'd gone to the meetings, he'd shouted his objections, he'd presented his grandfather's original deeds. But money, it seemed, had a way of speaking, louder than history. He drove straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller, a man with a tired face and a kind smile, had known Elias his entire life. He'd learned to fix a tractor engine in Elias's father's workshop and had once pulled Elias out of a fishing hole as a boy. The sheriff's office was quiet. The coffee was strong, the air smelled of stale paper and floor cleaner. Elias walked in, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his face a storm cloud. "Elias," Sheriff Miller said, his voice flat with what sounded like resignation. He didn't even need to ask. The sheriff had heard the rumors. He'd read the new ordinance. He knew. "They changed my locks." "Tom," Elias said, his voice low and tight. "They changed my locks on my own damn road." Sheriff Miller sighed, running a hand over his face. "I know, Elias. I got the call this morning. Sterling's people filed the notice. The new ordinance gives them the right. They've the road for their development. It's all legal." Unfortunately, Elias slammed his hand on the counter. The impact rattled a stack of papers. "Legal? How is it legal to take a man's property, his access, his life, without so much as a proper notice?" "The notice was posted on your gate, Elias," Sheriff Miller said, his tone still even, but his eyes were full of a deep, sorrowful fatigue. "The ordinance was passed last Tuesday. It was in the public record." "Public record? Tom, I'm a blacksmith, not a lawyer. I don't sit around reading county ordinances. You know that. This whole thing is a goddamn setup, a political assassination, and I'm the target." The sheriff didn't argue. He knew it was true. He knew how Sterling operated. He also knew the law. Elias, I can't help you. My hands are tied. They have the deed now. The old easement's been dissolved. Your property is now considered landlocked. Landlocked. The word hit Elias like a physical blow. It was the death sentence for any property. It meant his workshop, his home, his entire life was now a useless, inaccessible island. It meant his business was over. It meant they had won. Elias stood there, his mind reeling. The anger, so hot just a moment ago, began to crystallize into something cold and hard. He looked at the sheriff, at the man he had known since childhood, and saw not a friend, but a symbol of a system that had failed him, a system that had allowed this to happen. So what? I just let them have it, Elias asked, his voice now a dangerous whisper. I just let them take everything my family built, everything I built. I just walk away. Sheriff Miller stood up, coming around the desk. He placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. No, you get a lawyer, Elias. You fight this in court. This isn't right, and you know it. We can find a way to challenge it. Elias shrugged off the hand. The gesture was not one of disrespect, but of a man who had already moved past the point of legal niceties. You think a lawyer can fix this? They've got a whole firm. They've got the town council in their pocket. They've got judges on their payroll. They've got me over a barrel. Tom, they've got me with a padlock and a trespass notice. He turned and walked out of the office without another word. The door swung shut behind him with a soft thud. He didn't hear the sheriff call his name. He didn't see the look of regret on the man's face. All he saw was the injustice of it all, a black hole of frustration that was rapidly consuming him. He got back into his truck, but instead of driving away, he sat there, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He looked out the window at the town he had grown up in, a town that was now turning on him. He saw the new cafe with its modern facade, the sleek lines of the new town hall, the signs for Sterling Valley Estates promising a new era of luxury living. He saw the clean, sanitized world they were building on the bones of his past. His gaze drifted to a small, hand-painted sign for the development's private access road, the very road he was now forbidden to use. It was a well-maintained gravel path, freshly graded, leading away from the main road and winding past the old fence lines toward the new, manicured lots. It was pristine, a symbol of their power and their contempt. Elias closed his eyes, a deep breath shuddering through his chest. He saw his father, his face streaked with grease and sweat, teaching him to forge a horseshoe. He heard his mother's laugh echoing from the small porch of the house. He saw himself, a young boy, running down that very road. They were trying to erase it all, but they had made a mistake. They had underestimated a man whose life's work was to bend metal to his will. They had locked him out of his workshop, but they couldn't lock him out of his mind. And in his mind, a new kind of project was taking shape. One without rules, without legal paperwork, without permits. He started the truck. He didn't head home, because he couldn't. He didn't go to a lawyer's office, because he knew it was a waste of time. He drove down the main road, his eyes fixed on the pristine new access road for the Sterling Valley development. It was a beautiful, unblemished path. And that, he realized, was a problem he could fix. He was a blacksmith. He didn't deal with arguments and contracts. He dealt with iron and fire and things that bite. He pulled into a hardware store, his face set. He walked straight to the back, past the aisles of paint and lumber, to a section dedicated to fencing. His eyes fell on a large, heavy coil of galvanized steel razor wire. It was ugly, dangerous, and unapologetic. It was perfect. He bought 3 rolls. As he loaded them into his truck, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him, a cold resolve settling deep in his bones. He knew this was a point of no return. He was no longer the victim. He was the architect of his own terrible justice. He drove the air in the bed of Elias's truck smelled of gasoline and the cold metallic sting of razor wire. He pulled the Ford onto an old dirt trail, overgrown with ferns and blackberry bushes, that ran along the property line of what was once his land and was now Sterling's. This trail had been his father's shortcut to the river, a path so old and forgotten, it was little more than a whisper in the woods. Sterling's slick lawyers and engineers, Elias knew, would never have bothered to survey it. They were too focused on their new, pristine asphalt dot. Elias cut the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the cicadas. He stared at the 3 heavy coils of razor wire, their serrated edges glinting in the fading afternoon light. This was not a work of art. This was not a graceful gate or a strong, simple fence. This was a brutal, ugly act. But the world had shown him a brutal, ugly face this morning, and it was a language he now understood perfectly. He slid out of the truck, his movements slow and deliberate. He had no plan, no blueprint. He only had a Vishnu sense of what was owed. He was a man who built things to last, things that had purpose. This trap, he decided, would have a purpose too. It would be a monument to his rage, a silent declaration that some things cannot be bought. He rummaged in the back of his truck, pulling out a pair of thick leather gloves, an old pair of bolt cutters, and a canvas sack full of the tools he had thrown in his truck earlier that morning. These weren't for a simple padlock. In the sack were a claw hammer, a handful of railroad spikes, and several short, sturdy lengths of rebar he'd salvaged from a previous job. The rebar was what interested him most. It was the skeleton of construction, and he would twist it into a new, vengeful form. The new access road, pristine and freshly graded, was just a few feet through the tree line. Elias moved with a quiet efficiency, his years in the workshop giving him a keen eye for angles and structure. He found a spot where the tree line was dense and the late afternoon shadows were long, a place where a man driving a truck might not see a thing until it was too late. He began to uncoil the first roll of wire, the sound a soft, sinister rasp against the dry leaves. He didn't just string the wire across the road. He was a blacksmith, a man who understood pressure points and leverage. He drove 2 of the salvaged rebar lengths into the soft earth at a slight angle on either side of the road, leaving only a few inches of metal visible. He hammered them deep, ensuring they were firm and unmovable. Then, he wrapped the razor wire tightly around the rebar, securing it in place. The result was a low-slung, almost invisible tripwire. It wasn't designed to stop a car, but to slice through tires, a small silent act of sabotage that would bring their fancy trucks to a screeching halt. He set a second one 100 yards down the road, and a third 100 yards after that. He was methodical, his anger channeled into cold, precise action. With each spike he drove, with each loop of steel he secured, he felt the weight in his chest lessen, replaced by a grim, hard-won satisfaction. This was his work. It was ugly, but it was his. He finished as the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long purple shadows across the valley. He stood for a moment, hidden by the canopy, and looked at his handiwork. The traps were almost impossible to see. He had scattered leaves and branches over the taut wires, camouflaging them perfectly. They were silent, waiting. He was just about to pack up his tools when he heard the low, rumbling growl of an engine. It was coming from the direction of the main road. Elias froze, his breath catching in his throat. He had been so lost in his work, so consumed by the physical act of his vengeance, that he hadn't considered a timeline. He hadn't thought about who would be the first to find his trap. He hadn't thought about the consequences. The sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't a heavy dump truck or a piece of construction equipment. It was the distinctive sound of a pickup truck, an old one, a model that sounded a lot like his. Through a gap in the trees, he saw it, a beat-up dark blue Ford F-150, its bed filled with old tools and lumber. It was heading down the new access road, towards the Sterling Valley development. The driver was a young man, no older than 25, with a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He had the lean, sun-worn look of someone who worked for a living. He wasn't Robert Sterling. He wasn't one of the sharp-suited lawyers. He was a worker. Elias felt a cold dread creep into his stomach. This wasn't the target. This wasn't who he was doing this for. The truck rumbled on, its wheels crunching on the pristine gravel. Elias could feel his heart pounding in his chest, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. He wanted to shout, to warn the man, but the words stuck in his throat. He was a blacksmith, not a coward. He had made his choice. This was the consequence. The truck hit the first trap. There was a loud, sickening rumpus. The front passenger side tire went flat in an instant, the sound echoing through the quiet woods. The truck swerved violently, its old frame rattling. Before the driver wrestled it back into a straight line and brought it to a slow, shuddering halt, Elias stood there, frozen. His plan had worked, but the feeling was not one of satisfaction. It was a hollow, empty sickness. The young man swore, a string of curses that were half annoyance, half fear. He got out of the truck, slamming the door shut. He walked around to the front, squinting at the flat tire. He didn't immediately see the wire. He knelt down, running a hand over the tire's sidewall, and then, his gaze dropped to the ground. His eyes went wide. He saw the razor wire. He saw the rebar stakes. Elias held his breath. The young man stood up slowly, looking around. He didn't see Elias. The woods were a perfect concealment. The young man's eyes scanned the tree line, a look of genuine fear dawning on his face. He knew what this was. This wasn't an accident. This was an ambush. The young man panicked, and now in a hurry, turned to get his phone from the truck. He wasn't looking at the ground. He wasn't looking at the second trap, the one Elias had set 100 yards down the road. This one was different. It wasn't just a low-slung wire. It was a more complex construction, a razor wire snare designed to wrap around a person's leg. He took a step, then another. Elias saw it all, a silent, terrible ballet playing out in the fading light. He watched the young man's foot, clad in a worn work boot, snag on the concealed wire. The young man cried out, a sharp, terrified sound, and went down hard. As he fell, he flailed, his arms and legs tangling in the razor wire. The glint of steel was savage and brief. Elias stood in the shadows, his face pale, his stomach churning. He saw the young man, a stranger lying on the ground, his arms and legs a mess of blood and sharp glittering metal. He wasn't the enemy. He wasn't Sterling. He was just a guy trying to get to work. The young man was yelling now, a pained, desperate cry for help. Elias's revenge had just claimed its first victim, and it was a casualty he had never intended. As the sun set, casting a final, bloody crimson light across the scene, Elias was left with a terrible, gut-wrenching realization. His rage had not only locked Sterling out, it had locked him into a trap of his own making, and an innocent man was caught in the middle. The sound of the young man's cries was a far more sickening clang than any hammer on steel. Elias Thorne stood in the deepening shadows, a ghost in the woods, his heart a hammer in his chest. The young man's cries were no longer just a sound. They were a siren, a moral alarm ringing in his ears. The razor wire, once a symbol of his righteous fury, was now a vicious self-inflicted wound. This wasn't justice. This was a tragedy, born of his own hands. The boy's voice was full of a pain that wasn't just physical, it was terror. Elias had to move. He couldn't just stand there and watch. He couldn't be the kind of man who would let an innocent person bleed on his behalf. He took a step, a twig snapping under his work boot. The sound was a thunderclap in the silent woods. The young man, still writhing, stopped and looked up, his bloodshot eyes wide with fear. His head swiveled, trying to find the source of the sound. "Who's there?" the young man yelled, his voice raw. "Help me, I'm stuck." Elias stepped out from behind a thick fir tree. He came into the dim light of the evening, his silhouette large and menacing. He saw the boy's eyes widen in terror, not just at the sight of a stranger, but at the look on Elias's face, a mask of guilt and horror. The boy, who couldn't have been more than Caleb, a name Elias pulled from the air, didn't need to ask who had done this. The look on Elias's face told him everything he needed to know. Don't come any closer," the young man stammered, trying to crawl away, his movements only serving to twist the wire deeper into his flesh. "Stay back, I'm not going to hurt you," Elias said, his voice a low, rough rumble, a stranger's voice to his own ears. He held up his hands, palms out, a gesture of surrender. "I'm going to help you." The boy didn't believe him. Why would he? Elias was a phantom in the woods, the architect of this trap. But the blacksmith, with a lifetime spent working with sharp, unforgiving materials, knew that every second counted. Panic would only make it worse. "Listen to me," Elias said, his voice now firm, authoritative. It was the tone of a craftsman, of a man in control of his work, even this terrible, twisted version of it. "Stop moving. You're making it worse. I'm a blacksmith. I know how to handle this." Caleb, for that was his name, was crying now, a thin, helpless sound. "I'm stuck. My leg, my arm." Elias knelt down slowly, keeping his distance, not wanting to spook him further. He saw the extent of the damage. The razor wire had indeed ensnared him, wrapping around his calf and slicing deep into his forearm as he'd instinctively tried to break his fall. Blood, dark and thick, was already soaking through the fabric of his worn work jeans and the sleeve of his flannel shirt. What did you do?" Caleb whispered, the terror in his eyes slowly giving way to a bone-deep confusion. "Why? It was for them," Elias said, his gaze dropping to the ground, unable to meet the boy's eyes. "Not for you." The words were a pathetic, hollow defense, and Elias knew it. He didn't wait for a response. He had to act. He reached into his canvas sack and pulled out his bolt cutters. The boy flinched, a small, panicked gasp escaping his lips. "This is the only way," Elias said, his voice devoid of emotion. He saw the boy's fear, but he couldn't afford to get caught up in it. He had a job to do, a terrible, desperate one. He positioned the jaws of the cutters, avoiding the boy's skin, and with a swift, decisive motion, he snipped the first coil of wire. Snick, the sound was crisp, final. He worked with a gruesome efficiency, his years of experience with metal giving him a detached focus. He carefully unwove the wire, section by section, from the boy's leg. He saw the deep, jagged cuts, the crimson of blood against pale skin. The boy gritted his teeth, his whimpers stifled. Elias was an animal surgeon, a butcher of his own making. When the wire was finally off, Caleb's leg was a mangled, bleeding mess. "My arm," Caleb said, his voice trembling. Elias worked on the arm, the blood a dark smear on his leather gloves. He unraveled the wire, but a small piece had snagged deep, caught on a flap of skin. He couldn't just yank it out. The boy's pain was now a palpable thing in the air, a physical presence between them. Elias reached into the sack again, this time pulling out a small, worn field dressing from an old first aid kit he kept for minor workshop injuries. It was hopelessly inadequate, but it was all he had. "I've got to get you out of here," Elias said, as he wrapped the dressing tightly around Caleb's forearm. "I have to get you to a hospital." Who are you?" Caleb asked, his voice weak. The fear was still there, but now it was tinged with something else, a desperate need for a name, a face, something to make sense of this madness. "My name's Elias," he said, finally looking up. "I own the property at the end of the road, or I used to." Caleb stared at him, the pieces clicking into place. He'd heard the rumors at the job site, the stubborn old blacksmith who wouldn't sell, the man they were just going to wait out. Caleb had been on his way to his girlfriend's house, cutting through the new road to save time. He had no idea he was walking into a war. "You did this," Caleb said, the words a quiet accusation, a simple statement of fact. "I know," Elias said. The single syllable was a confession, an apology, a sentence, all in one. He looked at Caleb's truck, the flat tire, the lumber in the back, the lunch pail on the passenger seat. This was just a boy trying to make a living. Elias had seen his own son in him, a son who had moved to the city years ago, who would be just as lost, just as vulnerable. Can you stand? Elias asked, his tone now a plea. With a grunt of pain, Caleb tried to push himself up, but his leg buckled. Elias moved, his arm wrapping around the young man's waist. No, take it easy. We'll get there. He helped Caleb lean on him, supporting the boy's weight as they hobbled back through the tree line towards Elias's truck. The walk was excruciating. Caleb was in agony, and Elias was in a special kind of hell, a hell of his own making. Every step was a step away from his silent revenge and into a messy, complicated truth. When they finally reached the truck, Elias opened the passenger door, and with a final, desperate heave, helped the boy inside. Caleb slumped against the seat, his face ashen, his breathing shallow. Elias got in, his hands trembling as he started the engine. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't go to the local hospital. Sheriff Miller would be there, and the story of a young man caught in a razor wire trap on the Sterling Valley Access Road would lead straight back to him. The police would have a dozen questions, a dozen answers, that Elias couldn't give. He was a man without a plan, a man running on raw, panicked instinct. He drove past his own blocked gate, a monument to the injustice that had started all of this. The trespass notice, so infuriating this morning, was now a hollow joke. He was the real trespasser now, on a much deeper, more dangerous level. He drove past the main road, heading south. He knew of a small county hospital an hour away, far enough that he might have a chance to drop the boy off and disappear. But as he drove, he knew he couldn't just leave him. The boy needed more than just a drop-off. He needed an explanation. He needed justice. And Elias, in his own twisted way, was the only one who could give it to him. He was 100 feet down the road when he heard the faint, distant wail of a siren. It was coming from the direction of the Sterling Valley development. The truck's tires had been sliced, and the boy had a phone. He had called for help. Elias's blood ran cold. He had to make a choice. He could keep going, let the ambulance find the boy's truck and the traps, and hope they never put it all together. Or he could turn back and face the music. His conscience, a thing as unyielding as the iron he worked with, chose for him. He pulled over to the side of the road, his heart pounding. He looked at Caleb, whose eyes were now fluttering shut. Elias knew he had to get help, but he couldn't give them his name, his location. He had to be a ghost again, a man in the shadows. But this time, he was a ghost with a debt to pay. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the 911 button. He looked at Caleb, and in that moment, he realized the ultimate irony. The man, who had set a trap to make a point, was now the only one who could set an innocent man free. He pushed the button. The phone rang, a shrill, piercing sound in the quiet of the cab. When the dispatcher answered, Elias spoke, his voice low and urgent, a lie already forming on his lips. He was calling from a small diner 5 miles away, reporting a road hazard. He'd seen a man trapped in a collapsed trench. A story so convoluted, so improbable, that it might just buy him the time he needed to get Caleb to safety, but it would also bind him to a lie that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The shrill ring of the dispatcher's voice on the phone was a high-pitched knife twisting in Elias's gut. 911. What is your emergency? Elias took a shaky breath, forcing his voice to be calm, detached. Yeah, I'm calling from the Willamette Grill, about 5 miles south of the new Sterling Valley development. I was just driving past and I saw a truck pulled over on the new access road. Looked like a collapsed trench, and I thought I heard someone yelling. Couldn't see much. It's getting dark. He held his breath, waiting for the dispatcher's response. The lie was clumsy, but it was all he had. It was a desperate attempt to split the police and rescue efforts. The dispatcher's voice was professional, a machine of calm in the face of chaos. We have a unit en route to a call on that road already, sir. A young man reported a vehicle accident. Are you sure you heard a trench collapse? Yeah, Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, convincing growl. I've been in construction my whole life. I know the sound. It's a mess out there. Big mess. They'll need more than just one ambulance. Thank you, sir. We'll send a team to investigate, she said, her voice already moving on. The call ended with a click. Elias threw the phone onto the passenger seat. He looked at Caleb, whose head was slumped against the window. The boy was in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow. The makeshift field dressing was already soaked through, a dark, growing stain. The sound of the ambulance siren was now a distinct, rising scream in the night. It was splitting the silence, tearing through the quiet valley he had called home. Elias knew he had mere minutes. He slammed the truck into gear and pulled away from the roadside, heading south. He wasn't going to a hospital. He was going to a place only a few people in the world knew about, a place where a blacksmith's apprentice had been taught that some debts were paid in iron, not in dollars. Caleb's eyes flickered open. Where are we going? He asked, his voice weak. To get you help, Elias said, his eyes fixed on the road. Real help, not the kind that's going to ask questions I can't answer. You're going to run? Caleb whispered, the accusation in his voice as sharp as the razor wire that had sliced his skin. You're just going to leave me? No, Elias said. the word a promise as unbreakable as the steel he worked with. I'm not going to leave you. I am going to fix this. I put you here, and I'm going to get you out, I swear it. The boy fell silent, his face a grim mask of pain and fear. The truck rattled on, the dark forest a blur outside the window. They were a few miles out of town when Elias saw it in his rearview mirror, the flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car. Not the ambulance, the police. Sheriff Miller. Blood ran cold. They had already been to the scene. They had seen Caleb's truck, the traps, the blood. They would have run the plates on the abandoned vehicle. It wouldn't take Miller long to realize that a collapsed trench was a lie, and that the person who called it in was likely the same person who had set the traps. Miller was a good cop, and he was an old friend. He would know. Elias swerved the truck onto a gravel road he hadn't used in years. It was a treacherous path, full of potholes and loose rocks. But it was his territory. This was his home turf, his final advantage. He gunned the engine, the truck bucking and lurching, the tires spitting rocks. The patrol car, a sleek, modern vehicle, was not built for this. It bounced and struggled, losing ground. Elias pushed the old Ford harder, its engine groaning in protest. He had to lose him. He veered off the road and into a dense grove of trees. A small, hidden turnoff that led to the back of an old, abandoned mill. He cut the engine, and the world was silent again, save for the sound of Caleb's pained whimpers and the rapid thumping of his own heart. He looked in the rearview mirror. The patrol car was nowhere to be seen. He had bought himself a few minutes, maybe an hour, at most. He had to move. He got out of the truck, helped Caleb out, and supported the boy's weight as they limped toward the old mill. The building was a relic of a bygone era, a place of rust and decay, but it was his secret. The doors were old and chained shut, but Elias had another way in, a way he had built himself when he was a boy. He led Caleb to a small hidden maintenance entrance he had welded shut years ago. It took a few minutes of fumbling in the dark, but he managed to unbolt the old latch and pull the heavy door open. They were inside. The air in the mill was thick with the scent of dust and rot. Elias laid Caleb down on a dusty pile of old burlap sacks. The boy was shivering. "You're going to be okay," Elias said, a hollow promise he didn't even believe himself. He pulled a tarp over the truck, concealing it in the deep shadows of the mill. Then he turned to Caleb. He had to get him to his friend, a retired EMT named Sam who lived on a remote farm a few miles from the mill. Sam wouldn't ask questions. Sam would just help Dot as he was about to head out. Caleb reached up and grabbed his arm. "Why?" he asked again, his voice raw with a mix of pain and fury. "Why would you do this? What did they do to you?" Elias looked down at the boy, at the blood on his hands, at the fear in his eyes. He saw the full weight of his actions, not as a symbol of defiance, but as a crime. And in that moment, he knew he couldn't lie anymore. "They took my home," he said, the words a confession. "They took my family's land, my family's life's work, and I tried to take a piece of theirs." He didn't wait for Caleb's response. He couldn't. He had a debt to pay. He left Caleb in the dark, pulling the old maintenance door shut behind him, and ran into the night. A man on a mission to save the one person he had wronged. Meanwhile, back at the scene of the trap, Sheriff Miller was standing over a freshly cut length of razor wire. The road was a mess. The ambulance was there, but no one was in need of it. The tire tracks in the dirt told a story that was all too clear. The young man's truck had been abandoned, and the 911 call from the diner had been a dead end. Miller, with his tired, knowing eyes, walked over to the rebar spike that Elias had driven into the ground. He knelt down and saw it, a small, familiar mark on the metal. It was a distinctive pattern, a small, crescent-shaped indentation that Elias had always put on his rebar, a signature mark he had learned from his father. It was a tool mark, and Miller recognized it instantly. He stood up slowly, the cold, hard reality settling in. His old friend, the man he had grown up with, was not a victim, he was a criminal. And now, he was a fugitive. Elias ran through the night, a man stripped of his life and now of his dignity. The trees were a black and white blur, the ground a shifting carpet of leaves and hidden roots that threatened to trip him with every desperate stride. The scent of pine and damp earth filled his lungs, but it couldn't drown out the image of Caleb's ashen face, or the sound of the young man's whimpers echoing in his mind. He was a blacksmith, but tonight, he was a thief in the night, a common criminal, and his conscience was a heavier burden than any length of steel he had ever forged. His destination was a small, secluded farm, barely a dot on any modern map. It belonged to Sam, a man whose hands had healed more wounds than Elias's had ever created. Sam, a retired EMT, had seen the worst of humanity and had chosen to retire to the quiet solitude of his land, surrounded by a small herd of goats and the kind of silence that only a man who had heard too much could appreciate. The patrol car siren was a distant, mournful wail, a sound of law and order searching for a man who had abandoned both. Elias knew Miller would be close. He would have seen the tire marks, the blood, and the rebar spikes. He would have recognized the signature mark, a small, deliberate imperfection that only a fellow craftsman or an old friend would ever notice. The thought of Miller, of the betrayal and sadness he would feel, was another weight on Elias's back. He wasn't just running from the law. He was running from a friendship of 40 years. He burst out of the tree line and into a large open field. The moon, a sliver of silver in a sky of velvet black, cast a pale light on the tall swaying grass. The field was bordered by a barbed wire fence, and beyond it, he could see the faint yellow glow of a single window Sam's farmhouse. He scrambled over the fence, his jacket snagging on the sharp barbs, but he didn't stop. He had to get there. He had to get help for the boy. He reached the front porch of Sam's farmhouse, his lungs burning, his legs feeling like lead. He didn't bother to knock. He simply pounded on the door with a fist. A frantic, desperate rhythm. Sam opened the door, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. He was an old man, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He wore a heavy wool sweater and a look of deep suspicion. "Elias," he said, lowering the gun slightly, "what in the hell are you doing out here? You look like you've been chased by a bear. I need your help." "Sam?" Elias gasped, leaning against the door frame, his body shaking. "I did something stupid. I did something terrible. A kid is hurt." The words tumbled out of him, a torrent of confession and fear. He told Sam everything, about the padlock, the trespass notice, the razor wire, and finally, about the innocent boy he had left bleeding in the old mill. He didn't hide anything. The truth, in all its ugly detail, was the only currency he had left. Sam listened, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. He looked at Elias, at the blood on his hands, at the wildness in his eyes, at the man he had known and trusted his entire life, who was now a stranger. He took a long, slow breath, a deep, weary sigh. "Elias," he said, his voice quiet, "you have lost your mind." "I know," Elias said, his voice breaking. "I know I have. But the kid is hurt. He needs you, Sam. He needs you now. I can't take him to a hospital. They'll find me. They'll find him, and they'll know I did it. I can't leave him." Sam's eyes were full of a terrible, quiet grief. He had seen the result of men's rage his entire career, but he had never thought he would see it on the hands of his best friend. He walked back into the house, placing the shotgun on a rack by the fireplace. He was gone for a moment, and Elias's heart sank. He thought Sam would turn him away. He thought he would call the police. He thought he would be alone, with his guilt and the boy's life on his hands. But Sam came back, and in his hands, he held a medical bag. It was old, worn leather, filled with the tools of his old trade. "Get in your truck, Elias," he said, his voice firm, no longer full of quiet grief, but of professional purpose. "We're going to get that boy. And when we do, we're going to clean this mess up. Your mess." The words were an act of grace, a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Elias felt a wave of profound relief and gratitude wash over him. So powerful, it almost buckled his knees. He turned to go, but before he could leave, Sam put a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm. "But let me make one thing clear, Elias. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for the boy. And when this is over, you and I are going to have a talk about justice and what it really means." Elias nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He got back in his truck, a man with a new purpose. The sirens were closer now, a chorus of law and order echoing through the valley. Sam was right. This was his mess, and he was the only one who could clean it up. He drove back toward the abandoned mill, but he wasn't a criminal on the run anymore. He was a man with a chance at redemption, a man with a debt he was finally going to pay. But he was also a man leading his best friend directly into the path of a law he had just broken. He was running toward the sirens now, not away from them, and he had no idea what he would find when he got there. The old Ford rattled down the rutted, forgotten path that led to the mill, the headlights carving a tunnel of stark yellow light through the oppressive darkness. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken words. Sam sat stone-faced, his medical bag on his lap, a heavy silence hanging between him and Elias. The distant wail of the sirens was no longer a frantic cry for help, but a methodical, searching sound, the sound of the law closing in. "You're out of your mind, Elias," Sam finally said, his voice low and hard. "You set a trap. You could have killed someone. For a piece of dirt." "It's not just dirt," Elias retorted, his voice strained. "It's my home. It's my father's workshop. They tried to erase me, Sam, and you tried to erase them with razor wire." Sam shot back, his eyes narrowing. "There are lines, Elias, and you didn't just cross them, you ran straight through them and put a kid in a hospital bed because of it." He shook his head, a gesture of profound disappointment. "You're not a hero, Elias. You're a goddamn fool." The words hit Elias harder than any punch. He didn't argue. He couldn't. He drove in silence. The truth of Sam's words, a bitter pill. He had wanted to feel righteous, powerful. He wanted his revenge to be a clean, simple victory. Instead, it was a festering wound, a bloody mess that had entangled everyone he cared about. They pulled up to the back of the old mill, the truck's lights illuminating the rusted tin siding. Elias cut the engine, and the world went silent again, a waiting, breathless silence. The only sound was the incessant chirping of crickets and the frantic beat of Elias's own heart. He slid out of the truck and ran to the maintenance door. It was still ajar, a black maw in the side of the building. They found Caleb right where Elias had left him, a pale, shivering heap of pain on a pile of dusty burlap sacks. Sam knelt beside him, his face immediately transforming from one of judgment to one of professional calm. He was an EMT again, not a friend. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his hands deft and sure. He unzipped his medical bag, the glint of sterile steel instruments, a stark contrast to the rust and decay around them. "He's in shock," Sam said, his voice flat. He pressed a hand to Caleb's forehead. "He's cold, got a fever building." He then peeled away the makeshift bandage. From Caleb's arm, hissing softly through his teeth at the sight of the jagged, angry cuts, "This needs stitches. All of it, and a tetanus shot. We need to get him to a hospital, Elias. Now." "We can't," Elias said, his voice a desperate whisper. "They'll be here. Miller knows it was me." Sam looked up, his eyes meeting. Ilias's, the professional, calm, gone. "And what do you suggest we do, Ilias? Let the kid bleed out in a dusty old mill because you're afraid of a jail cell? Is that your idea of justice? Is that what your father would have done?" The words stung, a cruel and perfect hit. Elias had no answer. He stood there, a man cornered, a man whose desperate actions had led him to an impossible choice. He was caught between his past and his future, between the law and his own code, between the life of an innocent boy and his own freedom. Just as the silence was becoming unbearable, a new sound cut through the air, not the distant wail of a siren, but the soft crunch of tires on gravel, closer than it should be. The sound was not coming from the road they had taken, but from a different, hidden turnoff, a path that only a local would know. A pair of headlights sliced through the darkness, washing over the front of the old mill. "Damn it," Elias cursed under his breath. "Miller?" A familiar, powerful voice cut through the stillness. "Elias, come out with your hands up. No, you're in there." It was Sheriff Miller. He hadn't just followed the old road, he had anticipated where Elias would go. He knew him too well. Elias looked at Sam, his heart a cold lump in his chest. He looked at Caleb, and in that moment, he saw the final price of his revenge. He wasn't just a fugitive, he had put his best friend and an innocent boy in harm's way. He was a coward. He knew what he had to do. He stood up, his shoulders back, his hands held high in surrender. He walked to the door, opened it, and stepped into the stark beams of the patrol car's headlights. Sheriff Miller was standing there, his face a grim mask of betrayal and sadness. "Elias," he said, the word a simple statement of fact. He didn't say Thorn, he didn't say Perp, he said his name, and in that single word was the entire history of their friendship, now shattered. Miller didn't have his gun drawn. He just stood there, his hands on his hips, his tired eyes fixed on Elias. "What did you do, Elias?" he asked, the question not a demand for information, but a desperate plea for an answer. "I got a kid hurt, Tom," Elias said, his voice cracking. "He's inside. He needs help. Sam's with him." Miller's face, already grim, tightened further. He walked to the back of the patrol car, opened the trunk, and pulled out a flashlight. He walked toward the mill, past Elias. His silence, a more potent form of punishment than any handcuffs. Elias stood there, a man in the full glare of the law, but the true punishment was internal, the slow, agonizing realization of his own folly. But then, a new, terrible thought dawned on him. Miller hadn't just found him by chance. He had been so quick. He had known exactly where to look. "Tom," Elias said, his voice hoarse. "How did you find us?" Miller stopped, his hand on the mill door, and slowly turned to face Elias. His face was a shadow, but the look in his eyes was one of deep, agonizing conflict. "I didn't find you, Elias," he said, his voice a low, defeated whisper. "He called me Sterling. He filed a report this morning, a second one, after the first incident was reported. He was worried about his property. He told me exactly where the mill was. He said you had a history of trespassing. He knew all along." And in that moment, Elias understood. He wasn't a vigilante, he was a pawn. Sterling hadn't just changed his locks. He had baited a trap of his own, using Elias's rage as the spring. The real architect of this night's calamity wasn't Elias, but the man in the sharp suit, and the final irony was that the man who had lost everything was now going to be held responsible for the crimes of another.